Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. Though you may not have heard of the term pseudocide, you're almost certainly familiar with the concept. It's the act of convincing the world that you've died, even though you're actually alive. In other words, faking your own death. While there are many reasons someone might want to fake their own death, from escaping an unhappy life, to fraudulently collecting life insurance, to even playing a macabre practical joke, many of these crimes turn out to have pretty strange and surprising elements to them, whether it's because the person has a more unusual reason for wanting to be declared dead, or more commonly, because of the way in which they are discovered to be alive. Regular viewers of our channel might remember that this is not the first time we've covered stories of fake deaths. Last year, we did a video specifically about people who did so to avoid prison. If you haven't seen that video and find the topic interesting, be sure to check that out as well. Before we get to today's list, a reminder that if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. With that out of the way, here are 3 bizarre stories of people who faked their deaths. When Barbara Fraley met Richard Stegman, it likely appeared as if she had hit the jackpot. It was the mid-1980s, and Barbara was supporting herself as a waitress working in Olympia, Washington. Richard, on the other hand, was a wealthy contractor and successful business owner, the kind of person who could easily afford the finer things in life. Barbara was swept off her feet, and eventually she and Richard would marry and move to Hayden Lake, a suburb of Coeur d'Alene in northern Idaho. For several years, Barbara and Richard lived a seemingly quiet but affluent life there, until one day, everything came crashing down. It happened on November 6th, 1991, when the couple was eating breakfast at a restaurant in Ritzville, about a 2-hour drive over the border into Washington. When the time came to pay for the meal, Barbara handed over a $100 bill. It turned out to be counterfeit. While Barbara was immediately taken into custody, Richard was not. He produced a Florida driver's license and social security card identifying himself as Richard Stegman and was free to go. It wasn't until a few months later, when detectives looked further into the man's background, that their suspicions were raised. For starters, though Richard claimed to have been born in 1937, his social security number had not been issued until 1985. In fact, there seemed to be little trace of him at all before that date. Further investigation would soon uncover why. The real Richard Stegman had died in Florida in 1945, at the age of 8. It turned out that the man who had married Barbara Fraley was actually named Philip Wendell Champagne, and he was supposed to have died almost 10 years earlier. In August of 1982, Philip had supposedly fallen off of his brother's sailboat in the middle of the night, roughly 3 miles off the coast of Lopez Island in the San Juans. Though his body was never recovered, a substantial chunk of more than $1 million life insurance policy was paid out to another one of Philip's brothers following his apparent death. Philip Champagne was arrested in March of 1992, and fingerprint analysis confirmed his identity. Once he was in custody, even more details about his scheme were released. After taking a substantial cut of the insurance money from faking his death, he had moved to the Cayman Islands before reappearing in Washington around the time that he met Barbara. He had started counterfeiting money to keep up the facade that he was a wealthy businessman. When he had disappeared back in 1982, he had left behind a wife and 4 kids. In July of 1992, Philip was sentenced to 21 months in prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy to counterfeit money and passport fraud. He was never charged for life insurance fraud because by the time it was discovered, the statute of limitations for filing charges against him had expired. Barbara Fraley was convicted of passing counterfeit money around the same time of Philip's arrest in 1992 and was sentenced to 10 months in prison. Reports alleged that she was shocked to find out the extent of her husband's crimes when his case went to court. Though Philip could not be charged for his life insurance scheme, a year later he did plead guilty to other fraud charges, including bankruptcy fraud and bank fraud, Reports at the time say that he was facing a potential of up to 35 years in prison and $1.2 million in fines for the offenses, though unfortunately, we were unable to find out what sentence he ultimately received. Before 2008, it appeared that Stephen Callaway and his wife Nellie were living a perfectly normal, albeit affluent life. They lived in the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham in West London, widely considered to be one of the most expensive boroughs for residential properties in all of the UK. This high cost of living was seemingly no problem for the couple, though. Stephen made more than £100,000 a year working as a psychologist, and he and Nellie also owned 5 houses and apartments around London that they used as rental properties. There was even enough money left over for the couple to send their 2 children to private school. Though the Callaways were mostly comfortable and had at least £200,000 in savings, their multiple mortgages and children's school fees did add up to quite a substantial amount. However, instead of simply choosing to dip into their savings to cover their bills or sell off one of their properties, they instead decided to scam the Hammersmith and Fulham London Borough Council, fraudulently claiming £43,000 in housing and council tax benefits meant to aid the poor. While this worked for a little while, by March of 2008, officials had started to catch on to the Callaway scheme. That's when Stephen decided it was time to fake his death to escape the consequences of his actions. Stephen was inspired by the story of a man named John Darwin, who in the spring of 2002 had faked his own death with the help of his wife. After making it look like he had died in a canoeing accident on the North Sea, John's wife Anna was able to claim more than £250,000 in life insurance money. The money was used to pay off the couple's debts, and John fled to Panama, though he was eventually caught and arrested in 2007. Despite the fact that John Darwin and his wife were both convicted for their scheme, Stephen Callaway apparently believed he could do a better job of pulling off the crime, and in October of 2008, he and Nellie traveled to her home country of Russia to set their plan in motion. The couple planned the trip to look like a family vacation, one during which Nellie Callaway would bizarrely undergo a breast augmentation surgery. Amazingly, this surgery was also paid for with the money the couple had stolen. By the time Nellie Callaway returned to London in November and was arrested on fraud charges, Stephen was nowhere to be found. Nellie presented authorities with an urn supposedly containing her husband's remains, along with a death certificate saying that he had passed away while in Russia. Though a fraud case was still pursued against Nellie Callaway, she managed to convince a court that Stephen had been abusive towards her and had forced her to participate in his fraud scheme. She got away with a suspended sentence, and subsequently claimed life insurance policies that she and Stephen had taken out prior to faking his death. What authorities didn't know was that while in Russia, Stephen had bribed a mortuary worker with a bottle of vodka to place his passport on the body of a dead drifter. After that, Nellie had identified the body as Stephen's to obtain the death certificate. After the case against Nellie had ended, Stephen used the birth certificate of a 7-year-old from Belfast who had died of heart problems to obtain an Irish passport. He then returned to England under his new identity. Though this worked for a time, eventually Stephen got nervous because he had been recognized several times. He fled the country once again, first to Sri Lanka and then to Thailand. For months afterwards, Stephen lived consequence-free, and it appeared that he had gotten away with his crimes. He even began to make plans to move the rest of his family to Thailand as well. Unfortunately for Stephen, things took an unlucky turn for him when he was mugged and thieves made off with his fraudulently obtained passport. It meant that he could no longer collect the money that his wife was sending him. After that, he was reduced to living at an airport in Bangkok, surviving by begging for money and food. That was until journalists from back in the UK managed to track Stephen down and reported his whereabouts to the police. Stephen was arrested in the summer of 2011 and was eventually extradited back to England, where he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of benefit fraud and possession and use of a false identification document. In 2012, he was sentenced to 32 months in prison. In a comment to the news outlet The Daily Mail, Stevens said of his crime, quote, "Parts of my life on the run were very James Bond, but parts were also very squalid, and I wouldn't recommend what I have done." Unlike the other people on today's list, no one ever really bought the idea that Raymond Grady Stancil Jr. was actually dead when he disappeared while scuba diving in Honduras in 1975. The timing was incredibly suspicious. After all, he went missing just days before he was supposed to appear in court to face trial on drug smuggling charges, and he never should have been out of the United States in the first place. That being said, authorities weren't able to prove that he was alive either, and the case would turn into a baffling mystery that would remain unsolved until decades later. In 1974, 37-year-old Raymond Stancil Jr. officially worked as a fisherman and charter boat captain based out of Tarpon Springs, Florida. However, unofficially, he was one of the many people involved in the state's lucrative drug trade, smuggling tons of pot through the Gulf of Mexico and into Florida, where it was further transported and sold in major cities throughout the United States. Though smuggling allowed Stancil to make a decent living, his prospects took a turn for the worse when he was arrested in June of that year and indicted for smuggling more than 12 tons of pot into the country. At the time of Stancil's arrest, the evidence against him was fairly compelling. He was in possession of $25,000 in cash, receipts for two $25,000 Rolex watches, signed blank tourist visas that would allow him to get into Nicaragua anytime he wanted, unused checks for a Swiss bank account, and his passport indicated that he had been to 12 countries in the past 30 days. Luckily for Stancil, though, his illicit activities meant that he was easily able to post his $500,000 bail, and once he surrendered his U.S. passport, he was released from custody. His trial was scheduled for January 5, 1975, but as we all know now, he had no intentions of ever attending. On the morning that the proceedings began, Stancil's attorney announced that he had gone missing in a suspected scuba diving accident off the coast of the Honduran island of Roatan. The attorney claimed that airplanes were searching the shoreline, but no body had been found, and local authorities feared the worst. Authorities in the United States, however, were far less willing to believe the convenient timing of the supposed tragedy. Because Stancil's U.S. passport had been confiscated and he had a wife and 4 children, some even speculated that he might still be in the country. Despite their suspicions, all that investigators could do was chase down any lead that came their way. Many such leads emerged over the following years, particularly as word spread that some smugglers were using alleged sightings of Stancil as a way to try and get their charges reduced when they were arrested by U.S. officials. Understandably, most of these stories were pure fabrications. Authorities heard claims that Stancil was in Honduras, Panama, and in countless other ports in Central or South America. Even authorities in some of these countries couldn't be relied upon to provide accurate information sometimes. In 1976, officials in Honduras reported that they had captured Stancil. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement eagerly announced that he was in custody and sent officers to pick him up, only to find an empty cell waiting for them. The truth about what had happened to Stancil wouldn't be uncovered for 40 years, and would be kicked off in a way that no one had imagined, with a newspaper article on the other side of the world. On May 28, 2015, the Australian newspaper The Cairns Post released a short news story about the death of a beloved local business owner in the tropical far north Queensland region of the country. It read, quote, "The Daintree community has been left heartbroken by the road death of local tourism stalwart Dennis Lee Lafferty. The 75-year-old crocodile cruise operator died after his pickup truck failed to negotiate a bend on the Mossman Daintree Road and hit a tree on Tuesday. He was the 19th person to die on far north roads since the start of the year. There has been an outpouring of grief in the town where he operated the Daintree River Cruise Center for 28 years. Though the article seemed innocuous, it would soon be revealed as anything but, and grief would turn to shock when it was announced that Dennis Lee Lafferty's real name was in fact Raymond Stancil Jr. The news broke when a woman named Janet Wood and several others agreed to tell their story to the Tampa Bay Times following Stancil's funeral. Wood told the news outlet that back in 1974, she had been dating Stancil, who was cheating on his wife. After his arrest, and knowing that he was facing the possibility of several years in prison, Stancil and Wood decided to start a new life. They fled the U.S. by boat, sailing to Honduras, where they staged Stancil's death. Wood had been one of the people who had contacted the authorities about the so-called accident, slipping away before she was ever suspected of any wrongdoing. From there, the couple sailed to Venezuela before flying to Peru, Tahiti, and finally Australia. They got married along the way, and Stancil adopted the alias Dennis Lafferty, the name he would live under for the rest of his life. Wood didn't bother adopting an alias because she wasn't being investigated, and entered Australia under her own name. Wood and Stancil settled in far north Queensland, initially living on a 53-foot boat, but eventually moving into a home that Stancil designed and built. They had 2 daughters, and in 1987 started the Daintree River Cruise Center, offering boat trips through the rivers of the dense rainforest. It was through this business that Stancil would develop his beloved reputation amongst locals and tourists alike. Though authorities back in the U.S. had heard rumors for decades about Stancil's supposed exploits in Central and South America, Wood insisted that none of them were true. In fact, she believed that Stancil never made contact with the family that he left behind in the U.S. ever again. She said that she had only reconnected with her own family several years earlier, after she and Stancil got divorced and she began traveling back to the U.S. periodically. According to the Tampa Bay Times, there were a select few close friends that knew Stancil's true identity, but that was it, and those friends were sworn to secrecy. Even after the Tampa Bay Times released their story about Stancil several weeks after his death, many that knew him during his many years in Australia reportedly refused to believe that he could ever be involved in an activity like drug smuggling. Those remaining U.S. investigators who were still alive at the time the discovery was made were more easy to convince, having never believed that Stancil was dead in the first place. One retired Florida Department of Law Enforcement official told the Tampa Bay Times that he could still recall Stancil's case number even after all these years, saying, quote, "It is forever emblazoned in my mind." Do you know of any other cases like this that you think we should check out? Tell us about them in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. Thank you for watching.